Welcome to part 6 of the Wyld Whirl Quilt Along. This week is my favorite week because this week we are quilting. So let's get started. We first need to assemble our backing fabric. Depending on the size of quilt you're making, you are likely going to need to piece together some fabric to make it big enough for the back of your quilt. So you can take your yardage and just find the middle point and cut it in half. For this step, I just typically use scissors. I don't worry about a rotary cutter. This cut doesn't need to be perfect. We're going to end up trimming it off later. And then we're going to be matching up selvage edge to selvage edge. You could go ahead and just sew these two together at like a 3/8-ish seam allowance. Or if you want to get fancy, we can pattern match the back. So let's look at how we do that. For this, I just need to find similar points in the pattern where they match essentially. And honestly, with this fabric, it took me a little while. The repeat on this was a little harder for me to find, but once I got it figured out, it was easy. And luckily, I had just enough fabric to make it work. Make sure if you're going to be matching the back that you get a little bit extra fabric, probably like an extra half yard or so, because you're going to need to kind of move it like this, like I'm eating up like 8 inches or so to make this pattern match. So make sure you have enough fabric. So I'm just finding where the pattern matches, and then I folded it over and am lining up the crease on top of the pattern. And I'm trying to make sure that I'm folding it in the same spot all throughout the design. So like on this one, it's the side of the little ghosty head. So I'm making sure that's where it is creased down on this end. And then once I have that in place, I am taking my iron and just giving that a really good press. I'm not worried about getting it perfectly in place yet. I just want to get that really nice crease on there. And then I just got a fancy new glue tip for my glue bottle, and I'm very excited about it. I'm very happy with it. So I'm just running a quick bead of glue right along the very edge and then lining that up with the pattern on the fabric that I'm stitching to. So I'm going to get that all lined up, and then I like to just give it a good finger press. That kind of gets it to tack down and starts drying the glue. And then once I have everything perfectly in position, I'll come in with the iron and just set the iron on there to heat set the glue and to dry it. You want to make sure that it's completely dry before we start sewing. And then this is the other half. I just kind of slid it down my ironing board, did the same thing for the other half, got it all matched up and set it with the glue. Now we're at the machine and we're ready to sew these two pieces together. So it's as simple as just flipping over that right side so they are right sides together. And then I am stitching right in the crease line that I created when I pressed that fabric over. So this is really easy. Just let that line feed right into the center of your machine foot. Kind of focus right out in the front of your foot, not right at the needle, and make sure the weight of the fabric is up on the table so it's not pulling at all. But just make sure everything's nice and flat as it goes through the machine and stitch those two pieces together. And then once they're done, you can check and look at that. We got a really nice little pattern match here. I'm pretty excited about that. And then you could get your rotary cutter out and trim this down. I honestly just take my scissors and trim it to about 1/2 inch and then give it a really nice press to the side and to the same side that I folded it when I was matching it up. So we've got that all ready to go. And now we are ready to baste our quilt. So this is where we are joining the 3 layers all together. And I always start by taping my backing to the floor right side down. I find that holding it in place makes it a lot easier to get everything nice and smooth. And I just work side to side. And a trick I do is I stick the tape to the fabric first, and then I give it a very ever so gentle tug to pull it nice and taut, and then push the tape down. Make sure you don't pull too much. You don't want to stretch it because that can cause it to ripple. It is just a teeny tiny bit to get everything to be nice and flat. So I'm doing that on all 4 sides, and then I'm also going to add it to all 4 corners. If you are doing a bigger quilt, you may also want to add tape in between the corner and the side just to hold everything in place. Just depends on how big the quilt is. So once we've got that all taped down, we are ready to add our batting layer. And let's stop and chat about batting really quick. There are so many different types of batting out there. Poly blends, we're using a bamboo cotton blend, wool, silk, high loft, low loft. I could talk forever about it. There's some really good blog posts if you just Google like different types of quilt batting. But I really love this cotton bamboo blend that we have. This is a low loft, so it's very thin, and I like that for a quilt. If you want a super duper warm quilt, like a wool batting or a really high loft batting, or you could even double layer your batting. But I'm putting the batting down with the sort of softer, fuzzier side up, and then just smoothing that out onto my backing fabric. And now it's time for our quilt top. I'm so excited. So I am doing my best to get this centered on the batting and the backing. So you can see now why that your backing and your batting need to be bigger than your quilt top. So that way you can easily get your quilt top centered and make sure that you have room in case anything shifts when we go to quilt. And something to note, I'm cutting it a little close here. I would recommend having more like this space, not that skinny little side that I have going, but it's going to be okay. So now we are basting. We're bringing all 3 layers together. You can do this with pins. I'm going to demonstrate that. This is not actually how I like to baste, but it is a very common way of basting a quilt. So I did want to show how to do it. So basically, you're just using that safety pin, and these are special basting pins that have a little curve to them. And you're just picking up all 3 layers and pinning them together. You want to have your pins spaced about like a palm width apart or about 4 inches. So you want to have a lot of pins because you don't want things to be able to shift. And then if you know where you're going to be quilting, be sure to place your pins out of the way of your quilting line. Otherwise, you're going to be constantly stopping to remove your pins. To be honest, you're going to be constantly stopping to remove your pins anyway, which is one of the reasons I don't love pin basting. And I don't know, it's just not for me. It's not for me, but you should try it and see if you like it. It might be for you. I like glue basting, and I typically usually make my own homemade basting spray, but I saw someone using good old fashioned Elmer's school glue to baste their quilt. And I thought, hey, I'm going to try this because I was out of my homemade basting spray and it does take a while to make. So I decided to try Elmer's glue, and spoiler alert, it was amazing. I'm never making basting spray again. It worked fantastic. It was a pain in the butt to spread it on with that precision tip that I had on. So that side took a long time to get the glue on. And then for the second side, and I forgot to mention, I'm just peeling back the batting and the quilt top layer halfway. I've switched over to the regular glue tip and we're just drizzling. We're just doing a little drizzle drazzle. And I maybe went a little heavy with this. I probably didn't need as much as I used. But I went back and kind of smoothed out any areas where it was really a big glob and just tried to smooth that out a little bit. And then when you're smoothing it back, smooth from the center out and be very, very gentle. You don't want to stretch anything, you don't want to pull anything. If you're doing a bigger quilt, this is definitely a 2-person job, so you can kind of hand off the quilt to each other. So we have this last side here that I'm pulling back. I'm going to drizzle on the glue and then pull it back and smooth from the center out to the sides. So make sure everything's nice and in place. I like to give it a few pats. And then I'm going in with my iron to heat set and dry the glue, just picking it up and setting it down and doing that over the whole quilt top. And this does take a while, so get comfy. I got this funny little shot of myself. I'm sad my head was cut off because it felt very like Renaissance painting to me, like sad girl basting her quilt. I thought it was silly. Anyways, you're going to be hanging out for a little bit. So, throw on some music, throw on a podcast, and go ahead and iron that quilt. And before you freak out, I've been doing this on my floors for years and I've never had any issues. That's all I'm going to say. Anywhere where I had a little tacky spot of glue that was still wet, I went back with my iron and just set it on there again to make sure it was dry. And then I flipped it over to the back and I went over the back again with the iron. And then just for good measure, I went and ate dinner at this point and took a little break just to make sure that glue was 100% dry before I put it into my sewing machine. And then we are back and we are marking our quilting lines. You can quilt this however you want. You could do little squiggles, you can do a grid, diagonals, whatever you want. It's totally up to you. But we do need to mark our lines. So I'm using a Hera marker. This is kind of a fancy one I have. but this is just a tool with a kind of edge on it that can leave a crease. So I'm using my ruler and then just using that hair marker to leave a crease in my fabric. I like this because it doesn't put anything onto the fabric. I have no risk of using a washable marker or a chalk line or something that could potentially not come out later. This is just a crease. It will 100% come out when I wash the quilt. And you don't have to do this. You don't have to mark every single line like I'm doing. There's guide bar tools you can use. You could use painter's tape. I've seen people do that. Those methods just never really worked well for me. This is what's always worked best. So, this is the method I like to use. But again, try everything. You should try all the things because everybody has different tastes and preferences and things that work for them. And try them all and see what works for you. But this is what I like to do is with my hero marker, go in and just mark off all these lines. And I'm kind of just echoing the shapes that are already in the quilt. I'm following the diagonals and the little pinwheels and just kind of extending those out. And oh yeah, if this all seemed exhausting and you're like, I don't want to do this, you don't have to. You can take your quilt to a long armor. I often go to long arm rental near me and rent time on their long arm and do things like this that are really, really fun. And the best part is you don't have to baste your quilt. So if you don't want to baste, that's an option. But we're going to go ahead and get quilting on this quilt. But first up, we've got to pick our thread. So I am a big fan of using 100% cotton thread with your cotton quilt. However, I'm also a really big fan of using materials that you already have. And I already had this poly thread in my stash. So we're pulling it out as options. And when you're looking at your thread options, be sure to pull them off of the spool and stretch the thread across all of the fabrics in your quilt so you can get an idea of what it's going to look like. You can see the white and cream are pretty high contrast. They're really popping. The orange blends pretty well. And then the blue kind of pops on the lighter colors. So it depends. If you want your stitches to stand out a lot, use a high contrast thread. If you want your quilting to kind of just blend, like I do, pick something more mid-tone like this orange. And I'm actually going to use the blue on the back because it is a perfect match for the back and it's just going to blend right in. I'm really excited about it. And then this is a great time to clean your machine. In fact, I really, really highly, highly, highly recommend you clean your machine at this stage. Get all the fuzzies out of there, get a fresh needle in there, and your quilting's going to go a lot better if you take the time to do this part first. So I got it cleaned. I like using these quilting needles, but a Microtex needle, a Teflon needle, something that's nice and sharp. And I like the 9014 size. I also wound 2 bobbins. So that way when one eventually runs out, I don't have to stop and wind another one. I've got one ready to go. And then I got my thread loaded. And before I start sewing, I'm making a couple of adjustments. So I'm turning my stitch length up to 3. It's just like a looks thing and it goes a little quicker. And then this is a setting to lower the presser foot pressure. So I'm just turning that down so that when the foot comes down, it's not sitting quite so hard on all of those layers of fabric. And then I'm also engaging my even feed foot. So that's this little plastic piece that comes down. It grabs the back of my foot and it helps pull all of the layers together through evenly. You can also get a walking foot for your machine that'll do kind of the same thing. So looking at the quilt here, deciding how we're going to quilt, I like to start at the middle and then work my way to the edges. Some folks like to start at one side and work their way all the way to the other side. It's up to you, but for the most part, you want to start on the same side every single time. So I'm starting with this center line right here, and I'm starting on this side. I'm going to leave this first pass in real time so you can kind of really see how not very quickly this goes, honestly. But I am picking up the quilt and just holding it nice and flat and then letting the machine kind of pull it through. And I'm stopping real quick to check my tension. I am seeing my top thread on the back. So I'm turning my tension up just a couple notches. And then I will keep going. And then these areas where I am stitching down the seam line, that's called stitch in the ditch, where you're stitching in between 2 fabric pieces. It's nice because you got a nice little guideline there. I also like to turn my speed down a little bit. So I did that as well, checking my tension again. And my tension still was like not quite right. So I bumped it up a couple more notches. And then we just kept going. So sit up nice and tall. I like to try to center the needle in the center of my body. And then I keep my hands in like a pretty wide grip. So I'm just kind of grabbing the edges of that quilt, keeping it flat as it goes through the machine. And then every like, I don't know, 3 or 4 inches, you've got to kind of stop and adjust everything. So just take your time and go slow. Don't try to rush through this step. You're going to get a lot better result if you just kind of slow down, take your time, enjoy the process. I did a final tension check and it did need a little bit more. So I nudged it just a little more and kept going with this first line of stitching. And stitch in the ditch is challenging. So if you are doing this and your stitch line's kind of all over the place and it's not perfect, don't sweat it. Mine is not perfect. And I've done this a ton of times. It's really hard to get it exactly in the center. And also, washing a quilt is like magic. Any sort of little mistakes like that just kind of disappear once you wash a quilt. It gets all crinkly and the stitch line kind of just sinks in. And honestly, no one's going to notice and no one is going to care, I promise. So just continue stitching and have fun. This is the funnest part for me. I love this quilting step. I have such a good time. I love putting on a show or a podcast and just going to town. And then you may be tempted to pull your quilt around like this and just stitch back down the other way, but we actually want to pull it all the way back. And I'm checking my tension again, and it was good. It was looking good, but we're going to continue pulling that quilt all the way back into our lap and then moving on to our next line of stitching. So we're starting from the same side that we started from earlier. And we want to do this because if we alternate, we're going to end up creating these kind of poles in the fabric. So by starting on the same side and ending on the same side, we keep the fabric kind of moving in the same direction. So here's kind of a wider angle view, and you can kind of see my hands kind of have a wider grip. And as far as the quilt going through the machine, I'm just kind of bunching it up in my hands and shoving it through. And then I bring it back and I go in to do the next line. And here's what it looks from my point of view. So where my eyes are focused are kind of right out in front of the foot. I'm not looking at the needle. I'm kind of looking right out front and I'm watching the center of that seam line just feed right down the center of my foot. If you're watching the needle, you can't really make adjustments at that point. So you've kind of got to look out ahead and just do your best to keep everything kind of like nice and straight through the machine. And again, don't sweat it if it's not perfect. I think having kind of, wobbly lines and imperfections, it shows the handmade quality of something like this. So please don't stress yourself out about things being perfect. So we're just continuing on until we get all the way to the corner. And then I stitched this last line and decided I wanted to tack down just the very corner so it didn't get turned or come apart. So I added one quick little line of stitching here. And then this time, now that I'm at the end, I am going to do a sort of 180. I'm going to turn it going the other direction, and I'm going to work from the center out again. The reason I like to do this is because then there is less quilt that I'm trying to shove through the throat opening in my machine. If I start at one side and work my way all the way to the other side, at some point I'm putting like that entire quilt in there, and that just feels wonky and awkward. So I work from the center out on each side, and then I went and did the other side. So created that crosshatch grid pattern. Don't forget to take breaks. Stand up, stretch, drink some water. Quilting takes a long time. So this is the other side, going back the other way. Same thing, working from the center out. And here we go. Oh my God, it's a quilt. It's so cute. And I was sitting here and I was staring at it and I was like, this looks great. But you know what might look even better is if I went in and I added more lines. So I used my hair marker to just kind of like mark off the additional lines just to give myself an idea of what it would look like. And this is what I was talking about earlier of start with a bigger grid because you can always go smaller and then you're not committed to a super tiny grid that you end up hating because of how long it's taking. But you can add on later if you want to, which is what I ended up deciding to do. So I added lines basically just going on the diagonal between all of the squares I had just created. Oh yeah, I did eventually run out of bobbin thread. So I wanted to show you how to pick up a line of quilting if you have your bobbin thread run out. So I'm starting just like 3 stitches back from where my line ended. I am dropping the needle, bringing it back up, and then picking up that bobbin thread to the top. I'm back stitching 2 stitches and then just continuing my stitch line all the way out to the end. And this is a great way to pick up that stitch line if your bobbin thread breaks, your top thread breaks, something happens, and you need to just continue a line. That's an easy way to do it. Since we backstitched, we can just trim those threads nice and close, and then look at that. Like nothing ever happened. I also wanted to show what to do if you have a situation like this where the fabric is maybe bubbling up and looking like it's going to pucker. Just spread it out in front of the needle, and if you need to lift the foot, kind of spread the fabric out and then hold it while you lower the foot back down and then finish your stitch line. So that's an easy way. If you do end up getting puckers, again, don't sweat it. It's not a big deal, and once you wash the quilt, it's going to look great, I promise. So we finished our stitching, and oh my God, I'm so excited. This is looking so good. I'm so happy I decided to add the extra quilting. I really, really love how it turned out. And be sure to come back next week and we'll put binding on and finish this quilt. Oh my God, I'm so excited.